Quick question. What's the difference between a spy movie and a gangster movie? Yeah, I know. One is about spies and the other is about gangsters. But what does that mean? I mean, fundamentally, how do these movies differ from one another? And more importantly, how does that affect our appreciation of these movies? For instance, I think it's fair to say that a spy movie is essentially about misleading the enemy. It's about subterfuge and surviving in the shadows of a hostile land. But a gangster movie is fundamentally different. It's about standing up for who you are, who your people are, your gang, right? You stand up to other gangs, you stand up to the police, and you fight for survival in a place that you consider to be your home, even if other people challenge that assertion and or the way that you choose to live. See how those two are very different kinds of stories? If you went into a theater expecting one, but were given the other, you might be disappointed, or at the very least, you'd be surprised. And that's what I want to explore in this lecture, the expectations conveyed by certain kinds of films. You might call them genres, but I'd like to use a little bit more nuance in our conversation. So we'll start by differentiating between what I like to call macro genres and micro genres. And I'll show you how audience expectations can be met and subverted by combining macro genres with the 11 super genres. By the end of this lecture, I hope to demonstrate how these three simple concepts, super genres, macro genres, and micro genres, how they work together to create the expectations that we have for nearly any feature film you'll see in the theaters today. A tall order, I know, but once you understand the inner workings of these tools, you'll be able to really understand why and how stories are shaped specifically for their audiences. And once you can see these patterns and these techniques, you'll be better able to appreciate the work being done behind the scenes to create a great heist movie. Or was it an escape movie? Because there is a difference, you know. To start, let's take a step back. In a previous lecture, I outlined in detail the idea that there are 11 supergenres. 11. Action, crime, fantasy, horror, life, romance, science fiction, sports, thriller, war, and western. And each of these 11 supergenres is defined by three specific elements: atmosphere, character, and story. For instance, crime films typically explore themes of truth, justice, and freedom, and contain the central conflict of criminal versus lawman. Of course, the criminal can exist in a variety of forms. Someone who is intentionally breaking the law, accidentally breaking the law, or circumstantially breaking the law, but for seemingly heroic purposes. Similarly, the lawman might also appear in various guises. It might be the story of a lawyer, members of a jury, a valiant police officer, or a vengeful victim of some crime. Regardless, crime films make the audience jump through a series of mental hoops as we watch this battle between criminals and those intent on stopping them. Now, of course, the hoops look different in each movie, but don't be fooled. You've seen them a million times. They're either trying to solve the crime along with the detective, or we're figuring out how the complex heist might fall apart. We're imagining how the convict is going to escape, or how the lawyer is going to win a conviction at the trial. And because of all this mental hoop jumping, the writer and the director know that we, the audience, are already thinking on all cylinders. And so they play into that. using double crosses, verbal gymnastics, interwoven storylines to keep us on our toes. We expect this in a crime movie. But in a romance, not so much. But in a crime movie, without a doubt. Also, in a crime movie, the story tends to jump back and forth between the good, the law, and the bad, the criminal. And part of the fun for the audience is to decide who is on which side. Of course, there are some crime movies, gangster movies come to mind, where we're set up to root for the anti-hero. The Godfather, for instance. In these movies, the, quote, good guys are the gangsters, and we're rooting for them to win against the, quote, bad guys, even though that might be the police, the FBI, other gangsters, what have you. But the point of the matter is that crime movies typically jump back and forth between the two camps, the, quote, good guys and the, quote, bad guys. Are you with me so far? Does it seem like I'm describing a crime movie? Okay, and of course there are a few other expectations, like in the end, we expect justice to be served in a crime movie. We don't always know whose justice it will be or what it will look like, but by the end of the movie, the initial crime will be put to bed, and justice in some fashion will be served. Guaranteed. We also expect double crosses. We expect clues, weapons, witnesses, judgment, henchmen, and hideouts, right? Those sorts of things, I mean, there's a whole longer list, but you get the idea. These are all of the things that make a crime story dangerous, and at the same time, believable that these sorts of stories can exist right under our noses, in our backyards, in our neighborhoods, in our cities, where both criminal and legal characters can blend into their surroundings, where people can hide inside of a uniform or a suit, ever ready to launch their next criminal activity or spring into action to save the day. That's the crime supergenre. A movie where crime is committed, where the audience finds excitement in the criminal act and in the violence that surrounds it, and where weapons, clues, and bystanders are all utilized to solve a crime and administer justice. The end. Am I right? Pretty close? I know, it's broad. It's very broad, like a golfer's umbrella. I get that. But there are a lot of films that need to stand underneath that umbrella and that expanse and not get wet. So that's crime. And there are 10 others, like I said, each equally as broad, but each specific in their atmosphere, character, and story. Okay, so that's supergenre. And I would argue, and I have in my book, The Screenwriter's Taxonomy, that nearly every narrative feature film fits under these 11 supergenre umbrellas. At first blush, though, people find this idea very limiting, insulting even, that every film can be boiled down to 11 categories. But that's only part of the equation. That's the X factor, if you will. But now let me give you the Y factor. I call these macro genres. And there's 50 of them, at least 50 of them. And obviously, we don't have time to discuss all 50 of them, but we've already discussed some, so let's revisit. Gangster movies, spy movies, heist movies, and escape movies. And 2 more for good measure. How about cop movies and detective movies? Now, I'll talk about some of the others in a moment, but let's start with these 6. That's about 12% of the total. At first blush, these all seem to stand under the crime movie super umbrella. Pretty easily, I'd say. Gangster, spy, heist, escape, cop, and detective movies are all going to have some sort of crime and criminal, law and law enforcement taking place in the normal confines of our normal world. With people in uniforms and people hiding, weapons and clues, the innocent, the victims, and the witnesses. With an ending where, right or wrong, good or bad, justice is seemingly delivered. Think of it. I mean, use specific films. Gangster movies like The Godfather or American Gangster. How about spy movies like Goldfinger or 3 Days of the Condor? Heist movies? Reservoir Dogs? The Killing? Escape movies like Cool Hand Luke or Midnight Express? How about cop movies? Or more broadly, law enforcement movies like Seven or Silence of the Lambs, or detective movies like Chinatown, Sherlock Holmes. Now, let's take a minute and do some comparisons here. Those are all crime movies, right? But there are some fundamental differences here. Let's shake them out a little bit and give them some air. The first differential point I notice is who we root for. Remember, the supergenres were defined by atmosphere, character, and story. And to quote one of my favorite Coen brother movies, I'm talking about character. Think about it. In gangster, heist, and escape movies, we're almost always rooting for the criminals, right? The Godfather, American Gangster, Reservoir Dogs, The Killing, Cool Hand Luke, and Midnight Express all come as examples. Our protagonists are lawbreakers, and yet we want them to succeed, to pull off the crime, take back the neighborhood, or break out of prison. I mean, think about it. What's the last escape movie you watched where you rooted for the escape to fail? This is what's known as developing an anti-hero, where the protagonist is not necessarily a nice person, and yet they become the de facto hero of the story. This is in contrast to spy, cop, and detective movies, where we actively root for the law enforcement character to defeat the bad guy, the criminal. We know that through hard work, clever subterfuge, and a keen intellect, and maybe a little bit of physical roughhouse, our legal hero is going to come out on top or die trying. Goldfinger, 3 Days of the Condor, Seven, Silence of the Lambs, Chinatown, Sherlock Holmes.